We must speak the truth about terror.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
It is Monday, November 11th, and today is Veterans Day, Veterans Day 2019. And of course, we get the usual from from everyone on down, from the president to the mouthpieces in the media and government of, what this day means. It's a day of solemn celebration and all this and that. And obviously, as we and others have documented and have talked about ad nauseum so many different avenues and outlets over the years, is that obviously, you see a celebration or a glorification. Once again, this is just another event, along with obviously Memorial Day and the 4th of July and a few other events that take place every year that just perpetuate this glorification of the idea of the military and of militarism and of waging wars that are ostensibly for our freedom, but are really, I think, honestly and unfortunately, something much darker, as you have this continued efforts to continue to manipulate the public with this, I think, false patriotism, this false sense of love and patriotism for your country that goes based on the idea that, we are in the world and waging war for noble reasons and for humanitarian reasons. And so it is a very solemn celebration for a lot of reasons, just not for the reasons I think that, we're given within the mainstream society. And so, Jeremy, I know you have a few thoughts on this Veterans Day, so I'll hand the floor over to you.
So yes, 11/11/19. It's also the
Armistice Day.
Armistice Day, right? Exactly, too. And so,
which was the end of the first war to end all wars.
So it's the World War I origins, in many ways, of this holiday and this tradition makes me want to dig into that aspect, and I think we'll sort of set that aside for now, but I do just want to mention the origins of the World War I as allegedly the war to end all wars. I would say it was the war to begin the entire modern era of war making, and how it was not done for principled reasons. And so you see the combination both of, in a U.S. context, both domestically, the origins of really, I would call it seditious laws in relationship to things like the Espionage Act. Over 1,000 Americans spent multiple years in jail, I think, imprisoned for speaking out against the war in different forms. And so there's that whole, the authoritarian aspect and reactionary response domestically in relationship to the global machinations of World War I are still resonating to today. And then there's also the aspect of the war itself and the initiation of things like chemical warfare and trench warfare and just mass slaughter of millions and millions of whole generations in that context. And then also the global Zionist intrigue and machinations in relationship to World War I. And that history is pretty clear and becoming clearer, and maybe what we should do is link to, there's a PDF I found that is an article based on Alison Weir's writing. I think it is her writing from her book about the foundation of Israel in an American context, and how there was very much the case that there was a trade-off in many ways between aspects of the UK government in relationship to Zionist networks worldwide, that the Zionist networks would, in an American context, work to bring the Americans in on the side of the UK in order for a trade-off for acknowledgement and support by the British government of the Zionist project in Palestine. And that appears to have turned out as they proposed to. The Zionists kept their word. Even people, such high-level officers in the United States, such as eventual Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis and his lieutenant, really, in this Zionist secret society, the Parushim, the Pharisees, Felix Frankfurter, were intimately involved in this. And it's so obviously unethical, the idea of this a secret commitment, especially while being on the Supreme Court. And I would say probably a lot of this is not completely ended in such a way, especially when you think about the idea of maybe like the Federalist Society or other aspects in the more contemporary era. But that era, the World War I think is really needs to be dealt with. We're still dealing with the repercussions of all of that. So we will link to the article from Alison Weir that has some of the write-up about that history. And then still, there is an aspect, and we've said this before, where there's an honorable, deeply honorable tradition of people wanting to make a commitment, a disciplined commitment, to even up into the sacrifice of their own life in relationship to protecting their people in the way that at the level that they perceive it, right? And so that's a continuity of the human experience, I would say, right, where it starts from becoming your own person and willing to stand up for yourself as you grow up, to then being willing to stand up for your family, to standing up for your neighborhood or your tribe, to your country, or then onto humanity or life itself. And so these are all part of an evolution of a growing care and a disciplined willingness to sacrifice to secure or protect or defend that and those which you hold dear, which is a very deep aspect of the long-standing military tradition. So there is an aspect of this that has been highly abused, and anybody who really knows veterans knows that veterans are some of the most highly abused demographics in many ways, in terms of taken for granted in the way that their bodies have been abused, whether the chemicals that they've been exposed to, experimental vaccines often, and just in general, their body becomes almost a property of the U.S. government when they sign on the dotted line there. And yet at the same time, we are really meant to be a constitutional republic where every soldier is meant to know the traditions and the natural law behind the reason for the protection of the republic in the first place, including this idea that the commitment is not to an individual leader, is not to the commander-in-chief per se primarily, nor is it even to the government itself, or the state itself. It's to protect and defend the nature of the documents that are meant to protect the idea of the nation in relationship to taking an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Right. And so just in wrapping up, I just want to point out today that there was on C-SPAN, Washington Journal this morning, I thought it was really interesting. They interviewed Tara Kopp from McClatchy News Services, who they've put out a series of stories titled Stricken that talks about these massive growing cancer, apparently growing cancer rates across the entirety of the armed services. That looks like it's gone up intensely in the wake of the 9/11 wars, and so, for example, in the Navy, the numbers that they are running is that prostate cancers have gone up 10%, urinary cancers have gone up 56%, blood cancers up 16%, In the Air Force, the numbers are 44% up on prostate, 80% up on urinary, and 23% blood. And this is across the Army and the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, for example, has 98% increase in urinary cancers. So the Marine Corps appears to actually have been, been the most intensely affected by whatever phenomenon that is causing this. There was reference this morning to the consequences of the burn pits in the Iraq War context, where all this gear and human waste and leftover batteries and gear that they couldn't do anything with, allegedly, just got burned in pits. And they talk a lot about the soldiers. Of course, the soldiers are the closest, and so they're breathing this in every single day. And of course, that's going to end up in increasing cancer rates. But also, then, what didn't get talked about and what doesn't get talked about in relationship to the series of holidays that celebrate our war making is the other side, the recipients of our war making. For example, in this case, the Iraqi people. You think the Iraqi people have not caught also the brunt of this? We know this is also the case in relationship to not only this kind of assaultive pollution of their aerial environment in terms of these burn pits, but also things like depleted uranium and the amount of birth defects that have gone up. So there is a lot for us to deal with at this point, and more I then connect this back to these questions that are not being asked and answered by the presidential candidates, including how we've really analyzed it, where it looks very much that the reason, one of the key reasons for the abuse of girls from the United States, but also from other countries around the world in relationship to the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking network that involved really high-level, high-power people from around the world, that one key piece of that was very obviously leverage around the Iraq War. So the criminality is so pervasive, and yet it's still over there, or those people, or the veterans, and all of that. And so I just want to put in an urge that we all have duties in relationship to protecting and defending our people, our nation, the law, the common law, the natural law. In order to do that, we need to, first of all, figure out what the truth is, and then speak it, and then demand accountability in relationship to that truth. And I believe that's the highest level of respect that we can give to our people, including those that took an oath and served in our armed forces.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the biggest gift, the biggest thank you, since we're all about, it's one of the things, thank a veteran, thank military personnel. I think the biggest dose of appreciation, the biggest thank you, the biggest sense of gratitude you can give is to, I think, be honest. And I think that, nobody has a monopoly on the truth, but there's some very obvious true facts about the wages and the consequences of these perpetual wars, of the perpetual of this false sense, I think, of Americanism and patriotism that is based around glorification of this idea of what the military is supposed to represent, what our country is supposed to represent, and the wages and the consequences of this, both domestically here at home, when it comes to the, not only internationally in terms of the victims you just talked about, but also domestically here at home, and particularly on members of the military itself. And I think one of the truths that's really blatant is that we really, honestly, within the last century, it really is not, why are we celebrating, quote unquote, celebrating these days of all of these personnel who have given their lives over the past century? And I think, honestly, an honest look at history over the past 100+ years shows that very few of these lives were actually lost for a cause that was actually based on honesty and based on an honest defense of our land, as it says against all enemies, foreign and domestic. You see very few people have actually given what they call the ultimate sacrifice based on an actual principled defense of our country. And a matter of fact, you could say a lot of these foreign endeavors have very much weakened our country. And one more thing before we move on to what we're going to talk into reading from continuing chapter 10 of Seth Abramson's Proof of Conspiracy, I wanted to bring up what you were talking about with Armistice Day and this crucially important period of history here, the year of the decade between 1910 and 1920. This was a crucial decade in terms of perhaps the complete takeover of the basically of the U.S. government in terms of being a force for perpetual war through the blackmailing of Woodrow Wilson by people who were probably very close to the Brandeis Frankfurter network, particularly Samuel Untermeyer, and the intrigues over Wilson being blackmailed with affairs, out of marriage affairs as a professor at the University of Princeton, and also Wilson's accepting of the Federal Reserve Act, which took place under him, the institution and the creation of the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and all of the intrigue surrounding those organizations through through institutions such as the B'nai B'rith, and many of these organizations are just offshoots of this, and they appear more and more as we look through the last century of history and through current events, look more and more to just be mechanisms of a means to further divide and conquer the people of the U.S. as a means to complete a takeover of the country and of the people. And I think that this is a very crucial period of history here, laying it out, not only with the events of World War I, but all the intrigue surrounding so many different events that took place in this very crucial time period, this very crucial 10 to 15 year period at the turn of the 20th century. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, thank you for throwing that in there. And it may even make sense to do something like a historical review of this period that you're talking about, because all those things are crucial. I think it's even the case that even the income tax was introduced during that time also. And so if you put all of that together in terms of the domestic aspects of what evolved or devolved during that time in the United States of America, and combine that with the obvious core aspect of Zionist machinations, 100 years of that, just let's look at 100 years, and things have not changed. They've only actually been accentuated in a dark and negative fashion. If you think about the compromise of Woodrow Wilson based on an apparent affair, consenting adults, to the Israeli military intelligence defined Jeffrey Epstein compromise operation, where it's underage girls being trafficked against their ultimate consent, in order to compromise adult men, pretty much. So what we've seen here is just things don't change in many ways in these very core aspects in terms of the realpolitik, in terms of where the rubber meets the road, in terms of real politics. Things have only gotten worse, I would say, and it's up to us to actually face it and root it out.
Yes, I could not agree more. And so we will, it's very interesting continuing to do deep dives into this period of history, just a number of important events that I would say have influenced our modern history and events to this current day, at least as much as the obviously much more, I think, notorious in the eyes of the public, the Second World War, which followed it, of course. And these are all events that interconnected together. And so, yeah, just so much here. We could talk for hours or days about this, but there's only so much time, unfortunately. So we're going to move on. But we did want to address this and talk about this on this observance of Veterans Day, of course, which was originally Armistice Day, to celebrate the ending of the First World War, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but as you said, seemed to be the war that began so much of a chain of events that we're seeing still play out to this day.
Yes. So let's now move into see how much of this chapter, the end of this chapter 10 of Proof of Conspiracy, how Trump's international collusion is threatening American democracy, by Seth Abramson, we can get within our remaining time here. And this section of it gets into some key elements also that I think are going to become even more important for our understanding as the impeachment investigation unfolds, as the question of Ukraine, of Rudy Giuliani, of the Red Mafia, of the Russian-Israeli axis in relationship to the 11/9 Trump pump and dump chump operation, really, as it emerges to be seen as such. So, I would just urge people to continue going back to the documents that are being released. The FBI vault keeps on releasing very interesting documents, including things about the Finders sex abuse cult. Looks like there's intelligence aspects to that. More information on Epstein. There's been information released on Roy Cohn. So that's all there. And then even some of the transcripts of some of the witness testimony in relationship to the impeachment investigation should be read. And then more and more, there's even interesting IT studies about network analysis in terms of certain websites that are connected via IP address that we will also link to, that I believe all ties into the relevance of some of this information that really will highlight the geopolitics behind the Trump global collusion operation. But the mechanics of it sort of sit behind, and so we want to keep our eye on both of those things. So, Greg, any commentary before I begin?
No, let's get into it, and we'll just provide commentary as we go along.
Okay, so we're on.
Or I might chime in as you read as we go along. So
okay,
go
sounds
ahead.
good. We're on page 506 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Okay, quote, on February 26, 2019, while the nation is transfixed by the spectacle of the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, testifying publicly before Congress about Trump having ordered him to violate campaign finance laws in the run-up to the 2016 election, Trump's daughter and son-in-law meet with MBS in Riyadh. Unquote. Let's just point out, too, that what was also going on here, right, is Michael Cohen was being represented by Lanny Davis, the Clinton lawyer, and the Dmitry Firtash lawyer, the Ukrainian apparent mobster tied into the Mogilevich network.
Yes.
So that was going on. The other thing that's not talked about here is that Cohen also, during that testimony, confirmed that he had helped cover up, silence some of Trump's issues, the cleanup operation of some of Trump's issues. And what's in the background there, of course, is the Trump-Epstein, the accusations against them in relationship to Katie Johnson, and that civil suit that was brought in the run-up to the 2016 election, and a lot that sits behind that in terms of potential, other aspects of the deeper Trump-Epstein relationship. So I just wanted to point that that's in the background there.
Yes, indeed there is. And there's some other things even involving prominent evangelical leaders like Jerry Falwell Jr. that may have influenced their endorsements of Trump, which led to him getting obviously such a huge portion of that vote as well. Things that were not discussed with regards to Michael Cohen and his history, and I think the history of his dealings with Trump and with Trump's enemies, both perceived enemies and very real enemies. And the whole Lanny Davis aspect brings up to me a number of interesting aspects, number of interesting scenarios that I think that are going to lead into a topic that I think we're going to delve into in long form in the future, which is kind of a revisiting of the entire Clinton-Trump vast right-wing conspiracy narrative that we talked a lot about back in 2017. So look forward to that in the future.
Okay, good. Back to page 506 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, the White House statement on the meeting makes no mention of Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. resident and Washington Post journalist whom MBS stands accused of having had kidnapped, dismembered, executed, decapitated, dissolved, and incinerated. But it does discuss in broad terms, quote, American-Saudi cooperation and plans to improve conditions in the region through investment, unquote. The Kushner-MBS summit, along with the subsequent meeting with Turkey's Erdogan on February 27, thus officially kicks off Kushner's and Ivanka's Middle East quote-unquote tour to promote a Middle East peace plan, a tour that skips both Israel and the Palestinian territories, the two entities upon which any peace plan would depend, but whose conflict with each other, MBS's singular focus on Iran, has implicitly sidelined. In meeting with MBS, MBZ, Erdogan, Bahraini King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa, and Omani Sultan Qaboos bin Saeed al Saeed, Kushner appears to promise $25 billion in investments to the Palestinians and $40 billion to Egypt and Jordan, two of the original Red Sea conspirators, with, as the Times reports, quote, most of that money coming from the region's wealthiest states, among them Saudi Arabia, unquote. As the Arab Weekly notes, after each meeting, the White House's official statement on what was discussed is both curiously repetitive and oddly evasive. Quote, they almost all included a variation of this phrase. Quote, additionally, they, Kushner, and regional leaders discussed ways to improve the condition of the entire region through economic investment, unquote. An apparent reference, if a vague one, to Kushner and Flynn's Middle East Marshall Plan. Later reports will reveal that Kushner and Ivanka's trip to the Middle East was opaque even to those who accompanied them, with the Daily Beast reporting that while one senior State Department official was on the trip, quote, otherwise it left American diplomats in the dark, with embassy staff in Riyadh reportedly sidelined from participating in the meetings on the trip, including those with the royal court and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, unquote. The meetings with MBS are attended only by Kushner, Brian Hook, the State Department's special representative for Iran, and Trump's Middle East envoy, Jason Greenblatt. As the Daily Beast notes, Hook, quote, is one of several current and former State Department officials under investigation by the Office of the Inspector General for alleged politically motivated personnel decisions, unquote. Greenblatt, the Trump Organization attorney, hired into the administration by Kushner and Trump transition team brass in December 2016, is said by Fortune to be, quote, a key component of Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation of the president, unquote. Not because of any contacts between Greenblatt and the Russians, but because Greenblatt, as a Trump Organization executive vice president and in-house attorney for years, has a, quote, knowledge of Trump's business dealings that is unparalleled, unquote. And aside here, Greg, isn't Greenblatt the one who is also attempting to set up the meetings with the Burrell Lazar in Trump Tower? I believe it was Jason Greenblatt.
I believe you would be correct about that.
Okay, back to the text 507, proof of conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, Kushner thus has with him, as he meets privately with MBS, a man who can understand better than even Kushner how the Trump Organization might benefit from the, quote, economic investment, unquote, in the Middle East that the president's son-in-law is proposing. That Greenblatt is able to see clearly these Trump Organization benefiting angles as they arise may explain, too, why it was he who ended up with the job for which Thomas Barak had been so eagerly and perhaps avaricious.
Actually, Jeremy, I just wanted to verify real quick that it was a relative of Jason Greenblatt's by the name of David Klein who had reached out about possible Trump-Putin meeting, but that Jason Greenblatt, along with this relative, had met with Burrell Lazar at Trump Tower.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, back to the text.
But Lazar was at Trump Tower, and that becomes a very interesting question. I think really should be getting much more attention from people in relation to this whole Russia impeachment inquiry,
especially in the context of that recent video that came out of the talking about how Judaism and Jewish organizational power in Russia is very, very different than from the West, where the juxtaposition is versus the federations of the West versus Chabad runs 98% of the Jewish life in Russia, and Burrell Lazar being the head of both Chabad and of the Jewish community, I think, countrywide in Russia. and being a key figure, it looks like, in relationship to this Russian-Israeli axis, and then how it fits in, obviously, to the Red Mafia in the United States, and Brighton Beach and Trump Tower and Trump Florida and all that whole contingent, which we've been plumbing the depths of over the last 2 years.
And if indeed Trump is a long-term agent, asset, willful or unwillful dupe of this foreign entity, which it appears he has been, at least since going back to the 1980s, then the fact that this man who represents this Chabad movement, as we talked about in this video that lays out the relationship of the Jewish religious community in particular with the Russian establishment, Russian elites, meeting at then candidate Trump's tower, I think if we are to look at Trump as a foreign asset of some type, this is very important in terms of the power structure of the current state of Russia. So
completely agree. And then also that time period which you mentioned, the 80s, I think is a crucial one to then focus on too, because not only were the Soviets interested in Trump, and we've done some of the background there, especially in relationship to like books like Craig Unger's book. But then also that the 80s were also when Netanyahu was in New York City. I believe he was working on behalf of the state of Israel in the UN, and this is allegedly when relationship with Donald and Fred Trump got close in relationship to Netanyahu. And remember, Netanyahu is not only close, but a family friend with Jared Kushner's family, and as the apocryphal tale is told, is slept in Jared's bed when Netanyahu would stay with the Kushner family. And of course, this is also the time that Pollard is being run not only out of D.C. by Israeli military intelligence, Lacom largely, but also out of New York. That's where some of the administrative aspects. And you need to remember too that when Pollard was caught, I think it was the then head, maybe legal head. I think actually maybe the head of the ADL, who comes out of the law firm Skadden Arps, Kenneth Bialkin, who apparently went to Israel in person to deal with the fallout of the Pollard affair. And so you got to know that this, especially if you're looking at a Russian-Israeli intelligence axis of some sort, the 80s are a key component of when that really cements, very likely.
Two more asides here before we get back into the chapters. That one, 1983, which is right in the middle of all this, Donald Trump was awarded by the Israel National Fund, an organization that was actually established to set up Jewish settlements in Palestine in the turn of the 20th century, with the Tree of Life Award, which is one of the ultimate, which is their biggest award for people who are dedicated to the preservation and the continued thriving of the state of Israel. And this is also not long after Benjamin Netanyahu had worked in what is known as the Boston Consulting Group with none other than Mitt Romney. And there's very interesting history with Romney that we are going to get into at some point, I think, probably on a long form program. So,
okay, back to the text, page 507 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, and this is right after saying that Thomas Barak had been lobbying avariciously, it looks like, in order for Greenblatt to be in that position. And it also should be pointed out that Thomas Barak, at least according to the reporting of Michael Wolff, which should be questioned, he's definitely, Wolff is not some type of like good faith, honest character in all this. He's obviously defending some interests. The reporting that Thomas Barak, Donald Trump, and Jeffrey Epstein were long-term pals is also backed up by other sourcing, and of course the infamous video of Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump partying at Mar-a-Lago during a similar kind of time frame. And everybody, apparently the chatter is everybody knows that this was a crew, especially in the New York area, throughout many years. So I just wanted to point out that this Epstein is a component to these specific interests.
Well, according to Alex Jones, that video makes Trump even more likable. How the hell do you think he had 5 kids with 3 different women? Anyway.
I would just point out that to me, Donald Trump in that video looks almost like a like a lab rat being fed methamphetamine who's all pumped up, eager to go get some. So, it makes Donald Trump look even more like what he is to me. I don't know. Okay, but that's
I would agree with that.
agreement with Alex Jones. All right, back to the text. 507, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, indeed, this may be one reason that House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel will in March seek, quote, detailed documents from Kushner's February trip, including aircraft manifests, clearance records for each person who traveled, invoices and expense reports, and records relating to the State Department's participation in the trip, unquote. Congress's interest seems most focused on Hook, as evidenced by the House Foreign Affairs Committee seeking, quote, all emails Hook sent or received, unquote, relating to the trip, as well as any, quote, handwritten notes, unquote, that Hook took during any of the meetings he attended. It turns out that there is a reason for the Foreign Affairs Committee to be concerned. In March, it will be revealed that the Trump administration, quote, has approved 6 secret authorizations by companies to sell nuclear power, technology, and assistance to Saudi Arabia, unquote, thereby moving forward with the secret plans for U.S.-Saudi cooperation that former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was working on as early as 2015. Reuters notes that the secret authorizations granted by Trump's Energy Department are part of a, quote, quietly pursued wider deal on sharing U.S. nuclear power technology with Saudi Arabia, unquote. A plan that could, consistent with the long-standing multinational, quote, grand bargain, unquote, involving the Trumps, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Bahrain, and Egypt, see Russian construction firms acquire contracts to build nuclear power plants in the kingdom. Energy Secretary Rick Perry is revealed to have agreed to keep the authorizations, known as Part 810 authorizations, a secret at the request of the companies planning to sell nuclear technology to MBS, though, quote, in the past, the Energy Department had made previous Part 810 authorizations available for the public to read at its headquarters, unquote. The Trump administration offers no explanation for this breach of protocol other than to say that the request contained, quote, proprietary information, unquote. However, Energy Department regulations allow any proprietary information in a Part 810 to be so designated without the whole application becoming secret. Reaction to the Saudi nuclear deal is unambiguous in the media, with The Guardian calling, quote, grotesque, unquote, the very idea of, quote, selling state-of-the-art nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, potentially enabling Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's reckless regime to build nuclear weapons, unquote. The British media outlet adds that, quote, the nuclear scheme appears to provide further evidence of attempts to politicize the Trump presidency and of possible conflicts of interest and corruption. The nukes to Saudi affair may also help explain why Trump exculpated Salman's regime over its murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi and has ignored Saudi atrocities in Yemen and other abuses. As they say in the New York business circles, Trump has skin in the game, unquote. The New York Times concurs with Nicholas Kristof writing that, quote, of all the harebrained and unscrupulous dealings of the Trump administration in the last 2 years, one of the most shocking is a Trump plan to sell nuclear reactors to Saudi Arabia that could be used to make nuclear weapons. This is abominable policy tainted by a gargantuan conflict of interest involving Kushner, unquote. Kristof adds, quote, it may be conflicts like these, along with even murkier ones, that led American intelligence officials to refuse a top-secret security clearance for Kushner. Trump overruled them to grant Kushner the clearance, unquote. The columnist's critique of the Trump-MBS relationship also quotes Representative Brad Sherman, Democrat from California, who has opined that, quote, a country that can't be trusted with a bone saw shouldn't be trusted with nuclear weapons, unquote. Concern over the Trump administration's clandestine pursuit of a nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia is bipartisan, with Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, initiating an investigation with the Government Accountability Office, GAO, regarding the existence or parameters of any such deal. Of particular concern, Reuters notes, are statements MBS made to CBS News in 2018, insisting, quote, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would develop nuclear weapons if its rival Iran did, unquote. A troubling pronouncement given that MBS's ally Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal at a time when Iran was in compliance with the deal, thereby dramatically increasing the odds that Iran would itself withdraw from the deal and begin developing nuclear weapons. The Wire service also notes Saudi Arabia's history of, quote, pushing back against agreeing to U.S. standards that would block two paths to potentially making fissile material for nuclear weapons clandestinely, enriching uranium and reprocessing spent fuel, unquote. As Kushner is in Riyadh, Republicans at home are furious with the Trump administration for refusing to send a report to Congress about Jamal Khashoggi's assassination, a violation of the very Magnitsky Act that Kushner, Trump Jr., and Manafort had discussed overturning at their now infamous June 2016 meeting with Kremlin agents at Trump Tower. To justify this otherwise inexplicable refusal, one of Trump's top allies in the Senate, Jim Risch, Republican from Idaho, falsely tells, quote, several of his GOP colleagues that President Trump had complied with the Magnitsky Act by sending Congress a report via Risch determining who was responsible for the Saudi journalist's murder, unquote. Even though, writes Politico, quote, the administration had already publicly declared that it was going to ignore lawmakers' demand, unquote. Risch subsequently writes a letter asking the White House to simply give senators a classified briefing on the Khashoggi incident. The letter praises Trump for his, quote, ongoing efforts, unquote, to work with Congress, and makes no reference to the Magnitsky Act, even as Rubio is complaining to the media that Trump's apparent policy with respect to the act is, quote, that they refuse to follow the law with regard to Magnitsky, unquote. Of course, any following of the Magnitsky Act by the Trump administration could signal to the Kremlin, MBS, or other dictators and human rights violators around the world that Trump acknowledges the validity of the act as applicable U.S. law, or, still worse, that he supports it. Rubio's anger at Trump's recalcitrance is, per Politico, reflective of an incipient, quote, insurgency of enraged, unquote, Republican senators who, representing a majority of the GOP caucus in the Senate, quote, after receiving a classified briefing on Khashoggi's murder inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul from the intelligence community, concluded that MBS was complicit in the killing. Trump himself has been reluctant to ascribe any blame for Khashoggi's murder to the Crown Prince, citing the need to maintain a close relationship with Riyadh, unquote.
Yes, because we need jobs. That's the way it's been, that's the way it's been justified, is that this relationship and this $110 billion or whatever is going to give us jobs. But I wanted to throw in there when you think of the opposition of people like Marco Rubio, who definitely very much represent the Republican establishment in the Senate, to this what's going on with Saudi Arabia and this closer relationship, and at least the vocal outrage. I don't know if the vocal outrage actually amounts to anything over the murder of Khashoggi and over the U.S.-Saudi relationship under MBS and Trump in particular, in general, is that once again, I think this is another highlight of this, what we've seen is this split in foreign policy within kind of the neoconservative establishment, and that you have those who want to see have this shift in terms of getting closer to the real hardliners in Israel, as well as this new more hardline element in Saudi Arabia, just in that region of the world in general, as opposed to those who see these shifting of alliances as indicative of the U.S. losing power, as far as what we talked about with the U.S. as the global leader, and this very much in line with the Robert Kagan, William Kristol style neoconservatives. And so I think a lot of this anger from the likes of Marco Rubio certainly doesn't come out of an area of principle, no question about that. But I think it's very much rooted in this bigger split, I think, that's going on in terms of the foreign policy geopolitical relations within the Republican Party, within the neoconservative, you might call it, establishment under Trump. So,
thank you. That's a good point. The what we might call the neo-neoconservative versus paleo-neoconservative split, the potential Israel second neoconservatives versus the Israel first neoconservatives, or the multipolar neoconservatives versus the unipolar conservatives might be neoconservatives might be another way of talking about it. So on one side, as you pointed out, you could have a Marco Rubio and his intellectual godfathers of people like the Kagans and the Crystals versus the Michael Flynns, who are the new neoconservatives, who are backed obviously by his co-author Michael Ledeen.
but of course, there's still multiple areas where these interests all just manage to come together in a very convenient manner as well. So,
Exactly. All right, so back to the text.
such as perpetuating the fake war on terror, for example, the phony war on terror.
There's almost no the entire spectrum, as it's called in public politics in the U.S., basically backs that. So that goes even way beyond the neoconservative squabbling internally about where is the future of the world order, the new world order, going to be placed? Is it going to be D.C. To New York, or is it going to be Jerusalem, Tel Aviv to the east potentially? So. All right, back to the text, 510 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, in the wake of revelations that Trump and many of his top allies have been photographed with a former Florida day spa owner who has publicly boasted of selling access to the U.S. government to powerful Chinese nationals, Mother Jones reports that the, quote, head of an Asian GOP group says he wouldn't rule out the existence of illegal foreign donations to Trump, unquote, from Chinese sources. The accusation echoes an older one from the Steele dossier, which contends that Trump's, quote, business dealings in China and other emerging markets, unquote, are even more legally dubious than his associations with Russia, and include both bribes and kickbacks, the former a constitutionally enumerated impeachable offense. The Steele dossier becomes relevant again just as it is receiving confirmation on one of its major points of emphasis. A tech firm the dossier implies was exploited by Russian spies during the 2016 campaign was, evidence suggests, used in exactly the way Steele's intelligence indicated. Specifically, the dossier accused Alexei Gubarev's companies of using, quote, botnets and porn traffic to transmit viruses, plant bugs, steal data, and conduct, quote, altering operations, unquote, against the Democratic Party leadership, unquote.
Real quick before we continue with the where you referenced China just now and the Chinese day spa scandal that was at the center that came out as a result of the arrest of Patriots owner Robert Kraft of soliciting sex at this day spa, which I believe was about within 20 to 30 minutes of Mar-a-Lago. And of course, Robert Kraft is a good friend of Donald Trump's. But it reminded me of something we've talked about before, and we'll talk about again, no doubt, in the future, is Seth Abramson. I would like to see people like him and perhaps others start to delve into the China aspects of whatever, global collusion is going on, wherever China fits into this, because this was very much swept under the rug when Kraft was arrested, much quicker than even the Epstein story was swept under the rug. And that was all these photos that began to surface of these high-ranking Republican operatives, people within like the Council for National Policy, within the very much within the Trump Trump influence. People taking photos with this day spa owner, with other high-ranking, you might call them Chinese operatives within the U.S. And so this is very crucial, and I think it could go a long way into trying to determine current events in terms of this geopolitical global collusion which took place, but also in terms of trying to understand what's going on with the U.S.-China relationship currently.
Completely agree, because especially in terms of the global, quote-unquote, global collusion, the Red Sea conspiracy analysis that Seth Abramson does that includes Russia to Israel and other Middle Eastern countries, it doesn't really bring China into that specific fold. But if you were to focus on the Israel component of the Middle East conspiracy, a little more centrally, and then bring in the whole Epstein network, and I would then point out the whole Eric Prince network on top of that, and then clarify that whole situation with the Talpiot agenda, the technology transfer agenda, the technology tyranny agenda globally, especially in relationship to the war on terror and smart cities and AI and quantum computing and all that. This relationship would be further clarified. And I just do want to point out that this Prince component, Eric Prince component, is very much a Chinese relationship in terms of both Frontier, I believe, is companies Frontier Services Group and then Frontier Resources Group. And I believe Resources Group is the subsidiary. It was bought, large portions of it were invested and bought by a Chinese investment official very, very close to the highest levels of the Chinese government. And as we pointed out before, the question of Eric Prince's relationship with close to the highest levels of the Israeli government and the Netanyahu administration that go back to things like Chief of Staff Ari Haro, the relationship with Dorian Barak. Dorian Barak's company Indigo Global is very much also a heavily Chinese relationship. And then one last thing I would point out in terms of the JEDI so-called cloud, Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure handed over to Microsoft, who in the recent years bought Adalom Security to be put in front of its in charge of its cloud application security section. Adalom is started by Asaf Rappaport, along with two other fellow Talpiot program veterans and Unit 8200 veterans. And as I pointed out before, you go to Asaf Rappaport's resume, and in the background there is a relationship with working in China for McKinsey Consulting. And I believe there's a recent story about legal implications surrounding McKinsey ethics issues. So I just wanted to point out that if you dig deep into this entire nest of interests, this Israeli-China situation will clarify this matter a lot, I believe.
Yes, and all this is going on with Eric Prince while his friends and allies in the national security realm and within the Trump support base are constantly pushing China as the biggest national security threat to the U.S. So, and probably Eric Prince himself in a lot of cases. So it's a very interesting, very sordid web for sure.
Okay, so we just have 5 minutes left, but I'll just do a little bit more reading here. Very bottom of page 510 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, the New York Times notes that, quote, new evidence has emerged that indicates that internet service providers owned by Mr. Gubarev appear to have been used to do just that, unquote. The Atlantic reports that Manafort, sentenced to 7.5 years in federal prison after convictions in 2 federal courts, could still face collusion-related charges from federal law enforcement using evidence Robert Mueller gathered about Manafort's coordination with Kremlin agent Konstantin Kilimnik. Just so, the Justice Department has told a federal court that federal prosecutors are still using more than a dozen special counsel's office memos containing information from former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn for multiple ongoing criminal investigations, leading ABC News to conclude that, quote, much of the legal work that started under the special counsel probe into Russian meddling in the 2016 election could continue long after Mueller disbands his team, unquote. As Congress continues its own investigations of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections, one of the top Republicans in Washington, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, publicly torches Trump's Treasury Department for failing to, quote, provide Congress with certain bank records, unquote, his committee had previously requested, and indeed for falsely telling Congress that all such records had been proffered when, in fact, as revealed in a February 2019 BuzzFeed News article about, quote, a Russian-born lobbyist who was at a controversial June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, unquote, quote, hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred among individuals and in entities mentioned in Grassley's document request to Treasury, unquote, were never disclosed even to Senate Republicans. No explanation is ever provided for the Trump administration withholding these documents from Congress, but the BuzzFeed News article to which Grassley refers gives at least one possible explanation. The article alleges that, quote, Soviet military officer turned Washington lobbyist, unquote, Rinat Akhmetshin, received, quote, suspicious payments totaling $500,000 before and after, unquote, he secretly met with the president's son, son-in-law, and campaign manager at Trump Tower during the heat of the 2016 general election campaign, a meeting both the president and the president's son ultimately lied about in carefully orchestrated statements to the public. For his part, Trump Sr. even lied about his involvement in the writing of the statement that lied about the Trump Tower meeting Akhmetshin attended. As for Akhmetshin, banks had flagged the 2016 payments into his accounts on the, quote, suspicion that they showed Akhmetshin had violated federal lobbying laws by failing to register as a foreign lobbyist, unquote, and as, quote, potential evidence of corruption and bribery in the bid to overturn the sanctions law, the Magnitsky Act, unquote. When this information was turned over to Trump's Treasury Department, it was promptly buried and stayed buried even after Congress requested it. When BuzzFeed News locates Akhmetshin and asks him for a comment, he replies, quote, get the fuck out of here, okay, unquote. In his testimony before the Senate, Akhmetshin said that he went to Trump Tower because he, quote, just happened to be in New York City to see a play, unquote, when he received a, quote, last-minute invitation from self-described Kremlin informant Natalia Veselnitskaya, unquote, to go meet with Trump's son. Akhmetshin told the Senate that he wore a, quote, T-shirt and jeans, unquote, to the meeting. Despite Akhmetshin's unusual attire, he was apparently, quote, dressed entirely in pink, unquote, according to another meeting attendee, and the fact that, per one eyewitness account, he, quote, did most of the talking, unquote, at the Trump Tower meeting. Donald Trump Jr. will testify to Congress that he has no memory of the one-time Soviet military officer being in Trump Tower at all. We're in our last minute here, Greg. Do you want to make any final comments for the next 30, 45 seconds?
No, other than we're going to continue with this, and I'm glad we were able to get into this. I feel like this has been a much more. I feel like it's been one of our better shows as of late in terms of getting to really discuss this, the intrigues that are laid out in this book in depth. And I'm looking forward to continuing to get into this, and probably another show or two to finish covering this chapter. But I feel like this is all very important information for a grasp of our view of current events that are going on in terms of the narrative that we're getting right now.
All right. Thank you. Until next week, Greg. Antidote. We out.